Yeah, it's getting close.
Okay, it should be recording.
Oh, yeah. Now I have a cloud record symbol next to you. Good.
Okay. Okay, now I'm going to copy in the instructions.
Okay. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, well, it's one now, but I think we can go ahead and wait a few more minutes since we haven't had one of these. So maybe wait to another minute or so, and then we can get started. Okay. Okay, well, I think we have given everybody enough time to join. People can kind of hop on as we start. So hello and welcome to our monthly webinar for the Infrared Science Interest Group, or IRSIG. We haven't had one of these for a bit, so thanks to all of you for joining today. My name is Meredith McGregor. I am going to be one of your moderators today. The other is Lisa Locke, and we're both members of the IRSIG Leadership Council. So before Lisa introduces our speaker, I wanted to provide some brief instructions for how the webinar will work, since, as you might have noticed, we have a new platform. Now we're using Zoom instead of Adobe Connect. So I've typed and pasted all of these instructions into the chat window, which you should be able to either see or open if you kind of mouse over to the bottom of your screen. There should be something that says chat, and you can click on it and it will show the chat window. So please submit all of your questions via that chat window. Just go ahead and type them in and send them. Please try and do that as they come up instead of waiting until the end of the talk. And then when we get to the end of the talk, we'll start a Q&A period, and we're going to try and let participants actually ask their own questions. So we'll see how this goes. So if you have typed a question into the chat window, then Lisa or I will unmute you and say that you have the mic, and then you can go ahead and ask your question of our speaker. Hopefully this will go smoothly, but we will find out. Then second, please submit any additional feedback or comments or questions you have for the IRSIG Leadership Council through that chat window as well. We will try and answer these questions at the end of the hour, so kind of at the end of the Q&A session. If we run out of time, we can send an email response to you afterwards, but you can also email us directly later. You can also report technical difficulties in the chat window. Hopefully we don't have any, but if they do come up, we lose audio, then by letting us know, we can try and fix the problem. And finally, this webinar is recorded like all of our webinars, and you can find it later on our website, which is linked through the chat window now. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Meredith. So welcome, everybody. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Nicholas Siegler is the Chief Technologist of NASA's Exoplanet Exploration Program with the Jet Propulsion Lab. He is working to enable NASA missions to seek out evidence of life on planets outside the solar system. He helped found the NASA Starshade Tech Development Activity. He is working on a new space coronagraph testbed, and he is co-chairing a NASA study on the potential benefits of in-space assembly of next-generation space telescopes. So he'll be talking today on the current status of a NASA-chartered study on the possibility of a large aperture in-space assembled telescope. And his talk is entitled "Building the Future in-Space Assembled Telescope Study." So with that, here is Nicholas.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to share with you what I think is a really fascinating study, regardless if you're an astrophysicist or an engineer. This is definitely the future. It's really more a matter of when and not if, right? Because as astronomers, we all want bigger and bigger apertures or bigger and bigger interferometers. So this study is chartered by NASA. I will be presenting it to you in behalf of my co-chairs, Harley Thronson at NASA's Goddard, and Rudra Mukherjee. He's a robotic technologist at JPL, and I believe he's on the line as well. Now, we picked a telescope because we thought that would be one of the most common platforms for doing astrophysics, but I do want you to know that we did consider other large structures for the study, but in the end we picked the telescope. But that doesn't mean that we can't use some of the lessons learned in space assembly to apply towards interferometers. So this is David Leisowitz's Spirit concept for two 1-meter cryo mirrors on a 36-meter structure and a central beam combiner. So this is also something that we could build in space, and near and dear to my heart, we can also build large starshades, which are actually required if you have 10-meter class telescopes. The starshades get very, very large and almost to the point where they cannot be deployed. So there are lots of applications, but for the sake of our study, we went ahead and picked a traditional telescope in the UV visible near infrared spectrum, because that's where we want to do direct imaging of exoplanets. But what's kind of neat about these different types of large structures is that they all apply or fit in nicely into our NASA roadmap for exoplanet missions. So this is kind of my crystal ball of what we see down the pipeline, and my job is to make sure that we have the technologies in place when we need them. So on the x-axis, you see the timeline, and here's James Webb in 2021. We're still on track for W first in the middle of the next decade, and then we get into this sort of lighter area, which I entitled the possible pending decadal survey mission concepts. So here's the Starshade attached to a probe. Here's a Starshade again with HabEx. And then here are a couple very large space telescopes, the LUVOIR and Origins. And then going further out into the 2040s or 2050s, we have interferometry, which we know from those of us interested in the search for life, we're going to have to eventually get spectral signatures in the mid-infrared to be able to rule out some of the abiotic signatures that perhaps we get from visible and near-infrared detections. So these are some large structures, and we think it's only a matter of time until NASA really needs to build one of these, so we thought this is the time to start looking into this. Now, I'm going to introduce you to what I consider to be the current paradigm, right? The current paradigm for building large telescopes is quite challenging, right? The James Webb has been a real learning experience for all of us. And there have been a lot of challenges, but probably the biggest challenge that we've been most interested in is the constraints. And that's one part of what's been driving the cost, not everything, but it certainly has been playing a contributing factor. So the current paradigm is when you take a large telescope, regardless if it's in the visible or going out into the mid-infrared, and trying to squeeze that into something small and then successfully deploy it again into its final operational state. So just that set of activities has been extremely challenging and continues and will continue to be challenging. So in the case of James Webb, over 20 sequential deployment events, 40 deployment structures, just a little bit under 200 release mechanisms. And a lot of these release mechanisms have high fidelity. But the point is, all of these events have to work. And it's not just the volume challenge, right, of having to get something big into something small, but a lot of the engineers on James Webb will lament about all the lightweighting iterations that they've undergone in trying to meet the mass requirements, right? It's both volume and mass. So it's just enormous amount of effort towards lightweighting both the telescope and its instruments, right? And then there's some complex modeling that is associated to make sure that you haven't overdone it and the lightweighting structures will still survive the very violent launch environment. And then we all lament about the fact that if something, God forbid, occurs during the deployment of James Webb, we at this point do not have a recovery capability. So that's why so much effort has been done in making sure that everything deploys perfectly. And then we also acknowledge the fact that we can't swap out instruments. So we know that Hubble has been the poster child for what you can do with an old platform and keep sending up more modern and usable instruments. And Webb, unfortunately, will not give us that capability. So with an eye towards the future, these are all the things that we want to improve on to make future telescopes more affordable and to last longer. So with these thoughts in mind, we went to my boss's boss, Paul Hertz, who's the director of the Astrophysics Division, and we tried to persuade him, if you will, of funding a study that will answer the following question. When is it worth assembling space telescopes in space rather than building them on the Earth and deploying them autonomously from single launch vehicles? It's a very simple question, and it's the question that NASA really should have the answer to now. So when the decadal survey recommendations come out, and in fact, we just started, as you know, so when we get the results in the early part of 2021, NASA should have at least a position on what their implementation strategy is. So I give Paul Hertz a lot of credit. He accepted our request that we should at least start studying this, because I point out that in-space assembly is really not on the Science Mission Directorate's radar. We don't have a master plan for this, and it's something that we just started doing. So the deliverables of our study is a decadal survey white paper due in the middle of next month, and we're going to take a look at answering the question, at what size is in-space assembly enabling? And by enabling, I mean the only game in town. And then the more controversial question is, when is it enhancing? In other words, yes, we have fairings on launch vehicles that are large enough, but just because we can stow something big into something small doesn't mean that we should do it. So that'll be an interesting question. When is it cheaper or lower risk? Paul Hertz acknowledged that there might be a little bit of meat to this whole subject, so he didn't stop just with our study, but he actually inserted into the statement of task for the 2020 Decadal Survey, asking them to not shy away from white papers that invoke in-space assembly and servicing. So he's keeping a very open mind, because we all want large telescopes, right? Because of the amazing science that can come out of it, and we don't want to be hindered by concerns of cost and risk if we don't have to. Okay, so the study is called the ISAT, stands for In-Space Assembled Telescope. Here are the assumptions that went into this telescope. We picked a reference. As I said, we would have been happy to pick a mid-infrared telescope or even an interferometer, but we went ahead. Perhaps there's a bias for direct imaging of exoplanet science from my part, but it's also linked to the 2010 decadal survey that asked us to advance technologies for direct imaging of exoplanets. And so we went ahead with a UV vis near infrared. We studied 4 different sizes between 5 and 20 meters. The driving requirements, at least for the time being, is to enable a coronagraph. A coronagraph requires a very, very stable structure. If the engineers were going to barf at it, I always knew we can fall back to star shades, which is the one and only alternative to starlight suppression technologies, and that requires much less structural stability requirements. A lot of telescopes are going to Sun-Earth L2, so that was an easy destination to select as a reference. We went out on a limb and made a decision collectively that we were going to use existing launch vehicles with fairing sizes that already exist. So at every step of this study, you'll see that the team did not want to borrow too far from the future, and they wanted to go with things that already exist, because there's going to be lots of technology developments associated with something as far-reaching as in-space assembly. So if we can pick something, pick aspects that already exist, then we'll be in a better shape. And then just a reminder that while we only picked one concept, it is not a reference. It's not a down select, and it's not even a recommendation. It's just a reference concept, so we can kind of buzz out all of the issues that are associated with in-space assembly. And I assure you that we went into this was going down a path that no one has ever gone down before, to go as deep as we have. And so we wanted to just identify where are the challenges associated with in-space assembly. So again, it's not a recommendation, plenty of option space for other possibilities. So a little bit about the study itself. We broke up something complicated into 4 steps. Steps 1 and 2 were really about trying to select the reference telescope, right? I know you guys find it hard to believe, but if you put 50 astronomers and engineers into a room, I know you'll find it hard to believe that they won't all agree on one concept. So we spent many months discussing amongst ourselves what was the best reference, and it didn't take that long, but in the end we picked a reference telescope, which I'll show you, and we also picked an orbit, a type of assembly agent, astronaut versus robot, the platform in which we did the assembling, the launch vehicle, and I'll show you the CONOP. So that took us a while, but I'm happy to say that we've all agreed on the reference ever since then. We haven't had any go-backs. But the real meat of the study is this 2-pronged costing and risk approach. So we split our membership up into 2 teams. So step 3, which we call 2A, was a qualitative approach to understanding what the costs and risks are. This is an opportunity for us to engage some of the exceptionally talented engineers who have worked on Webb, the ISS, which is the poster child, right, for in-space assembly, Hubble, the poster child for servicing, and some other missions that have or are being planned for in space. So we didn't want to miss out on the lessons learned, because we certainly want to build on what these folks have learned. And then going where no man or woman has gone before, we took a crack at doing a grassroots cost estimate on an in-space assembled telescope, 5, 10, 15, 20 meters. Again, never done before to the level that we have attempted. And so I'm pleased with the product. We probably needed another year to get it right, but from a first cut, I think I'm pleased with where we're at. And so they're all done, right? We're now in the writing phase. I'm going to share with you what I'll call the interim report. We're not quite converged as a team. There's still about 5 weeks left on the clock, but I'll share with you, let's call it an interim result. I literally ran out of room on a slide to identify everyone who has participated in this study. We're we're pretty close to 100 engineers and scientists, mostly engineers, who have been involved. But I will say that we have gotten 6 NASA centers to come together, 14 private companies, 4 government agencies, and 5 universities. So we really were leveraging folks with experiences so they can share with us lessons learned, and also what the current state of the art is. So subject matter experts were drawn upon from all those missions that I mentioned before, along with future plans that both industry and NASA are considering. And you can see all the disciplines. RPO stands for Rendezvous and Proximity Operations. But these are all the disciplines that are affected by in-space assembly, so we want to bring them on board. The government agencies, the Naval Research Labs, DARPA, Air Force, and NRO, all of them are interested in building large telescopes. Some are interested in some particular planets more than others. And then here are the key commercial companies that are real stars in the field. We've had 4 face-to-face meetings where we got together. We've been swapping out the teams, or ramping different subject matter experts in and out as we needed them. So back in a year ago, actually, we brought the telescope experts to Caltech, and we talked a little bit about how you modularize a large telescope. We met 4 months later at Langley and talked a little bit about robotics, orbits, launch vehicles, assembly platforms. These are all things that I didn't have a clue about, and it's been a real thrill to learn. In fact, there isn't anyone, right, that is an expert in all of these things. That's what's been so amazing about this experience. We've all had to learn from each other. The qualitative team, so there's probably an age gradient in this picture. So we brought people that have been working on ISS and Hubble and some of the other missions. And then we most recently had a quantitative cost where we brought the leads for the cost assessment. And we had another 10 people on the phone also helping us out. So it was a well-balanced group. But I'm sure everyone's happy to get this thing down to the end. So here's what a modularized space telescope could potentially look like. If you ever wondered, what does it look like when you turn this thing into Legos? And, who knows, maybe if we're successful, we'll set out a toy so kids can build their own space telescopes. So this is an off-axis telescope. It can be 5 meters or 10 meters or 15 meters. I think what you're seeing here is a 20-meter off-axis. Here's a secondary mirror down here. And so this is what it would look like. A first cut at a CAD design of turning it into Legos. And then the specific parts, here's probably the most important part, the spacecraft bus with the solar arrays. That would be one module. And then all the other Legos. So here you see rafts. We call these rafts of mirror segments. In this particular case, you see 7 mirrors. These are meter class mirrors that all come together under one raft. Of course, they're tested on the ground. They go through all the same INT requirements that anything else that we would send up in space, but they're not necessarily integrated into a full telescope because these telescopes are getting very large. Here are the structural mechanisms. You see some of the instruments. Here's a lot more structure. Here are this was the first cut at the solar sunshades and the instruments. So this was the first cut at it. It's matured a lot since then, but you can see that all these things are their individual modules. And again, we test the heck out of them on the ground, but we make sure that they have plenty of correctability and adjustability in space, so that if there is a problem, we've given ourselves plenty of room to get everything to play nice together and meet the tolerance requirements. Here's what we picked for the concepts for, let's start off with assembly. Now, I want to impress upon you that the parameter space is quite huge. We spent a long time talking about what is going to assemble the Legos. And there are all types of cool things that I would have loved to show you, things like multi-limbed robots, free-flying spacecraft with 2 arms. But in the end, the team went with the more boring, but more importantly, the flight qualified solution, which are robotic arms. So I'm showing you probably the most well qualified robotic arms ever fabricated. These are 2 arms on the International Space Station, and the arms that we're going to be working with are going to be simpler than these. So robotic arms will be doing the assembly. The assembly platform, we looked at things like the ISS. Sounds like a good idea to build it there. You may have heard of NASA's idea for a gateway, something in the cislunar orbit. Other industries are talking about platforms. But in the end, the group decided, we're not going to hitch our concept to anybody else's. We're just going to go ahead and fly our own spacecraft bus, right? Every telescope needs a spacecraft bus. We'll retrofit it with other docking stations, so then we can send up future spacecraft with the bus, with the modules. And here you see the robotic arms that will be embedded onto the spacecraft bus, and that's what's going to be doing the assembly. So I thought that was a very nifty solution. Launch vehicles, again, they didn't want to borrow from the future, even though we acknowledge if NASA actually builds an SLS or SpaceX builds their big Falcon rocket, we have alternatives, but these are all rockets that exist today. And then the orbit, we had lots of conversation about what orbit. We have LEO, we have GEO, we have something called HEO, we have cislunar, and we have the final operational destination. So in the end, the team didn't actually see a major difference between assembling at cislunar and then traveling to the final operational destination, or just going ahead and building everything at Sun-Earth L1 or L2. There's a very low delta V highway, which I was introduced to, only tens of meters per second. So some people in the end felt, let's go ahead for our reference concept and pick cislunar. There's been lots of discussion of maybe a new space platform called the Gateway being built at cislunar. And if you could maybe accelerate the frequency of the launches, then you can build the assembly a lot faster. If you're stuck to a typical funding profile that results in maybe a couple launches per year, then it really doesn't make a difference where you go. So there you go. This was the concept that we came up with. Here's the ConOps. The first launch goes into space carrying the spacecraft bus, the deployable solar arrays, and the robotic arms. The second launch is then the first launch to provide something called a cargo delivery vehicle. So all this is just a smart upper stage, and then we stick all the lumber in the cargo delivery vehicle. It's got a little bit of smarts because it makes its way to the assembly location, which we just said is the spacecraft bus with the robotic arms. In fact, here's a zoomed up version. Here's your spacecraft bus. Here's robotic arm number 1. Here's number 2, and it grapples the smart upper stage that rendezvous with it. We've already done this. This is not new technology. We just did this with the Cygnus, and also SpaceX's Dragon cargo made its way to the ISS and was grappled by a robotic arm. It's then berthed into position, right? And then the robotic arms are free to unload the cargo, right? And the cargo is what holds all the modules, and then we can dispose, in this particular reference, the cargo delivery vehicle, and we then wait for the next series of launches to complete the assembly. So if you're building something at the size of 5 meters, that's a couple launches. This is either a Falcon Heavy, or at least in our study, I think we borrowed from something called the Vulcan, and we picked the Vulcan, which is on the books to be demoed in 2022-ish. It's quite taller. So we went with that 10-meter class telescope, which I would love to see. Only took 4 launches, and then you can see you get into more and more launches as you get into larger sizes. All right, let me tell you a little bit about the ConOps. So here's your spacecraft, and this is a result of the first launch. And so what you see now is the second launch, where you have that smart upper stage making it's been grappled by the first robotic arm. I'm not showing the second arm. And then it's going to berth to one of these portals and dock that first upper stage cargo delivery vehicle. Once that happens, we're in business. So we're showing just through illustrations, the robotic arm is now removing the stowed telescope backplanes. These backplanes deploy immediately as they are removed from the cargo vehicle, and now they're ready to be put into position. In fact, you can see an example of what these things look like in position, and you see the second cargo vehicle that's waiting to be unloaded. These robotic arms are not operating by themselves completely autonomously. There's something called supervised autonomous robotic assembly, very similar to what NASA does for the Mars rovers, right? The Mars rovers receive a series of macro commands, they execute them, and then they stop and they wait for further evaluation, inspection, and subsequent commands. So it'll give us a chance to make sure that everything is working properly. This is what it looks like, several structures down the path. You can see that it's extending out to 10 meters, and it's putting it in place. If we go to 20 meters, there will be little kind of footholds along the way for the inchworm robotic arms to get a better grip and to access regions further away. And this is what it looks like fully assembled. This is the backplane truss. And I love this because it's a lot of this we can actually demonstrate on Earth. All right. You know, the sun shield on Webb has been a challenge, so we've gone back to Northrop to come up with a simpler design. This is the sunshade paper towel dispenser approach, where you can see the robotic arm is holding on one end, and the other arm, the second arm, is just dispensing the sun shade. This is a very preliminary concept. We have others that, if we had more money and time, we would obviously do an engineering trade study, but obviously this is not being autonomously deployed. If there's a snag along the way, we have time to fix it or replace it. All right, so here's what that looks like. All right, and here we're showing now the first of the mirror rafts. As I mentioned before, 7-meter class segments have made their way, and you can see it's being handed off from one arm that unloaded it from the cargo delivery vehicle and is passing it on to the other arm. And you can see it snaps together like a jigsaw. And yes, you don't have to fully assemble the telescope in space to do science. There are cases where we can go ahead and start doing science just with one raft, right? And then we can add the subsequent rafts over time, so we can get a return on our yield sooner. Now come all the instruments and the secondary mirror assembly. So here's a secondary mirror embedded in its shroud, and now here's instruments one. Actually, one is over here, 2, 3, 4, and this last slice is the 5th instrument. And so, as you can tell, these instruments are really beefy. And for those of you that are instrument builders, in-space assembly really gives you that opportunity that you don't have to shrink all these things down, which are really expensive and risky. That mass and volume are actually your friends. And we think that by adding mass, you're actually saving cost because the instruments can be built faster. All right, and so this is what it looks like. What you see here are the 2 robotic arms having completed its installation of the instruments, and they're making their way down beneath the metering truss, and they're going to dispose the 2 cargo delivery vehicles, and then they're going to go into a hibernated state where they'll travel with the telescope. And what's really brilliant about this solution is when it's time to swap out instruments or maybe replace a broken something, folks at NASA people have lamented at NASA that yes, everybody loves servicing and swapping out instruments, but short of having astronauts to do it, there is no NASA servicing program. So there isn't a NASA servicing program because we don't know how to do it. And in this case, here's one solution to that. These cargo delivery vehicles come up with the next generation instruments, and the robotic arms wake up from their hibernation, and they deploy the instruments just like they did for the first assembly sequence. There's nothing different between servicing and assembly in this paradigm that I just showed you. All right, let's take a look at some of the results. I'll save you some of the sausage making, but I think you'll find these results extremely interesting and compelling. But I want to first start off by saying we're not starting from scratch, right? When I first started this effort, I was kind of a newbie to all of this, and I kind of felt this was science fiction, and I think that kind of intrigued me. But as it turns out, we are building on what has been done before. So here's Hubble, right? It's quite amazing how astronauts with their clumsy gloves were able to put in instruments as sophisticated as WIFPIC 2 and 3, and we've come up with ways to do automated instrument alignment that even an astronaut could do. Here's the poster child for what in-space assembly is. You know, people will say we've never done in-space assembly. Well, I beg to differ. Here's a 100-meter structure that has been put together through huge modules over the last several decades. So this is where we've learned about modularity, using multiple launch vehicles and robotic arms. Exactly the type of capabilities that we need to assemble telescopes. Back in the last decade, DARPA did just an extraordinary tech demo called Orbital Express, where they sent up 2 independent spacecrafts, and they were able to approach each other. You see in this illustration that the one on the left actually grappled the one on the right, and then they were able to capture and dock to each other, and then they were able to transfer simulated fuel. They were able to swap out avionic instruments, and so this was the first demo that we can actually do something like this. As we move forward today, the ISS continues to be more and more capable of doing robotic repairs. Autonomous docking is now quite commonplace, and we've even done some instrument assembly. Here's a picture of the Dragon resupply, exactly like I mentioned. There's a robotic arm that grappled it. We've learned a lot about building segmented optics, even though Webb has not yet flown. It's telling us how we can phase these segments so that we can get the correct tolerances for a paraboloid. And as I mentioned, we've learned a lot about supervised autonomy using the rovers currently operating on Mars. And there's lots of interest at commercial LEO. There's lots of interest in the infrastructure build-up, so there's clearly opportunities to leverage more and more. And then looking forward, you've heard NASA speak about their gateways, which will have important plans as NASA considers landing back on the moon in the next decade. Some of you may have heard of Restore-L. This is a demo of refueling a Landsat 7 spacecraft that will eventually run out of fuel. So we're going to refuel it and see if we can bring it back to life. And the Mars Sample Return is also a great demonstration of what we could do with long-distance telerobotics. So lots of activities here. We're not starting from scratch. When we talk about in-space assembly, the paradigm I want you to think about now is modularization is one massively important element, right? We're breaking things into Legos, and there's a lot of value in doing that we've learned collectively, right? You have something as complicated as a telescope, like a Keck, right, or a TMT, and so you break it into parts, right? You take something complicated, you break it into parts, so you're encapsulating the complexity. You have to know on day one what the interfaces are like. This is not something that you could wing until later. You have to define your interfaces. You have to define how you're going to assemble, service, repair in space, all during phase A activities. And then if you know what your fairing size is, you can customize that so it fits nicely into your fairing. So the other thing is, besides modularization, is multiple launches, right? So now you have opportunities to send up more modules and break away from that constraint that we talked about, either mass or volume. Yes, you have to pay for an additional launch, but you can see that the cost of these future launches are decreasing as we speak. So that addresses some of the challenges that we discussed earlier. So modularization and multiple launches opens up the door for so many other aspects of in-space assembly, like using the commercial cargo delivery vehicles. Supervised autonomous robotic arms is the other important part, because these Legos have to be put together. Now V&V is going to be different, because we're going to be doing a lot of V&V in space. There'll be a lot of V&V on the ground before we even allow the modules to be put into a rocket, but now we have to be different. We will be different on how we do our V&V program. The modules will be smart, right? So they will speak to us about what their state is. I can imagine things like onboard metrology, lots of model validation while it's in situ, not just having to estimate what backing out the 1G effect is going to be. And we can learn about performance in space before we send up the next vehicle. And then, of course, we talked about servicing. So servicing is going to be following exactly the same sequence of steps. We think we've already solved that problem. All right, now how is this going to be cheaper, right? From my perspective, from risk, it's a slam dunk. But you know, NASA struggles with cost. Everyone's interested in gaining a better ability at estimating the cost. Let's take a look at where the benefits come from. Well, we talked about relaxing the mass and volume constraints, right? I don't know if we know what the cost of that was with Webb, but we certainly have plenty of testimonials that the engineering complexity decreases because you can you don't have to iterate as many times. You don't have to lightweight and use materials that are not common, as Webb did with beryllium. And you know, the poor engineer that has to worry about how are you going to fold something this large, well, he's going to be unemployed, because that engineer is not going to be required. We're not going to have complicated deployments. We're going to use the benefits of modularization to deal with that, and we won't have to have as many mass iterations. We heard lots of testimonials from INT people who really struggled with putting together something as complicated as Webb. A lot of times you have to wait, right, for all the right parts to be there. When you modularize, you don't have to wait. You can test the heck out of your instruments and the various components and make sure that they have the adjustability and correctability needed. They meet their performance requirements, but you don't have the standing army that Webb has been suffering from. The critical path is not this narrow path. It's actually quite broad, and we could shift our INT team around. And then if something goes wrong, you can just pull out that one particular module. You don't have to pull out a whole bunch of other complicatedly integrated components like we have with Webb. It's unlikely that we're going to be doing end-to-end system testing, so we won't have to wait to put everything together. As I mentioned before, we're going to wait for build in on-orbit adjustability and correctability and save a lot of those expenses. All right. No doubt that these missions end up with a lot of oops at the end, right? That we can't fit into the fairing. We've busted our mass margins. And so now the program management has an option. They can still push back on the teams to say, no, I'm not happy with how fat your instrument is. But they can also say, you know, it's not worth it. It's not worth having to go through this massive system level lightweight iterating process. We can go ahead and maybe accept giving up margin, or maybe in the worst case, adding another launch vehicle. When you assemble something like a large telescope, all the interfaces have to be ruggedized, regardless if they need to or not, because they have to survive launch. So when you break them up into Legos, they don't have to be ruggedized. So you save on mass and you save on having to beef up these interfaces. We don't need new and large ground test facilities. These telescopes are getting big, so they're going to need new facilities, and you don't need that, or you can minimize the number of them that you need when you are only building smaller modules. You have an opportunity to spread the modules around. Like, so modularization enables the opportunity to get lots of people involved, and it's a lot easier to bring new industries and new universities into the mix, and even bring in international contributions to reduce your costs. I'm sure there's lots of countries who can't afford a big chunk of a telescope, but if you tell them, hey, we have a couple of modules that we could offer you involvement, I think they would jump to that opportunity. You also have an opportunity to flatten the funding profile, which is important in some cases. All right, I'm going to try to go a little faster here. I see we're at a quarter to the hour. Science benefits, right? So we heard our scientists loud and clear, no tyranny of the fairing, right? So the size of the fairing has been limiting the size of their telescope, right? And also limiting the size of their instruments. So by not having to be married to the fairing, it opens up all types of architectural and configuration possibilities for your telescopes and for your instruments. And now our telescopes can evolve to last decades. I predict that Webb will do fantastic things, but it will not, or it's unlikely to last more than a decade. So being able to architect this in to enable these telescopes to last decades will be fantastic. And we talked about the fact that we think we solved the servicer problem. All right, and then risk is the one I'm feeling most confident on. Again, God forbid that the Webb has a deployment challenge, something doesn't self-deploy. In-space assembly eliminates that risk. We still may have deployment challenges or assembly challenges, but it's not the end of the game, right? Launch failure doesn't have to be a mission failure. Right. Let me just skip down to the next slide. Now, it's not all roses, right? We also have kept a very long list of challenges that in-space assembly adds, right? It's not just benefits, but things like we expect that we'll have a lot more people involved early on in the building of telescopes, a lot more people involved than usual because we care about V&V and repairs early in our architectures. We've never done INT in space before, so that's going to take a lot of thought. While I predict that robotic arms will be donations from our neighbors from the north, we still have to demonstrate them in the lab. So that is not something that Webb has to deal with. So those are cost uppers, not to mention in-space rendezvous and capture is a cost upper. So these are things that don't exist today that we need to carve out money sufficiently because we're going to be adding more cost. That's if you're worried about the cost side. On the risk side, there seem to be plenty of benefits, and I'd be willing to pay more money to mitigate my risk. All right, so this might be my last slide, and I'll stop here. Here are the key findings, right? It says likely because we're not done, so give us a little bit of chance in the last 6 weeks to argue amongst ourselves, but I think I can share these. I'm feeling confident that we'll have language similar to this, like key finding 1. We didn't find any showstoppers, right? I was worried that this was going to be a lot of science fiction, and yes, we have some additional technology gaps that we need to close, and certainly lots of engineering development, but nothing that required reinventing physics, and nothing that required having to borrow too far from the future. Well, we've learned the hard way that when we worked with one of the NASA centers to help us estimate the cost of an in-space assembled telescope and using the traditional models that NASA has been using for some time, well, we found out, and they found out, that the models are just inadequate to cost the specific designs of an in-space assembled telescope. First and foremost, mass can be your friend. I've mentioned that several times here, and believe me, mass is not your friend for the current cost models. And then other things that I showed you just a few slides ago that should reduce cost, well, we got no benefit whatsoever. So that's just the state of affairs as of today. I mentioned that in-space assembly offers a natural solution to this servicing dilemma that I mentioned before. Now, fortunately, you guys don't have to worry about funding levels at this level, but we have heard from the National Management Office, the NASA Management Office, that they certainly care about cash flow. In fact, they care more about cash flow per year than total dollars. So if that's a game that is interesting, in-space assembly, because of its very clear definition of modules, allows you to really define and lock down how much money you actually need per year. And since things are not waiting on each other, you can actually get away with that and spend less per year, although you might spend more in the long term. All right, so 5 and 6 are, 5. So 5 tells us that even though we love astronauts, and they were part of our team, and we look forward to seeing a Gateway and the ISS continue, we don't need them. We would embrace them, but we don't need them to reach our goals. And then finding 6 and 7 goes back to Paul Hertz's original question that I started with. In-space assembly is indeed enabling. So basically, when you can't fold the telescopes tight enough to fit into a fairing, well, you have now exceeded what we can do with single launch vehicles. So in-space assembly certainly becomes enabling. If you believe in an SLS becoming realized, then the answer is about 15 meters. And if an SLS, for whatever reason, does not become realized, then you're shrinking down to maybe a 12-meter class telescopes. But the one that everybody is most interested in is, even though you might have an SLS, and even though you can fit it into a rocket, is that the smart thing to do? So one team, the qualitative team, concluded that they just did not see a desire to build a telescope larger than James Webb in the same format approach. Right, all the challenges I've been sharing with you for the last 45 minutes, they don't go away in the current paradigm. So their conclusion was somewhere larger than a Webb is probably the time when you want to start really thinking about in-space assembly. The quantitative team, well, we're still going through the dollars. Sorry to make you wait another 6 more weeks, but our final report will have the number. But I can leak out at least that I think it's going to be under 15 meters, that we think that there is a place under 15 meters where it's going to be cost competitive, if you will, with the current paradigm. And then when you fold in the risk benefits and the science benefits, we think the final result will definitely be less than 15 meters. So this is really my last slide. I believe we're only going to, I'm predicting we're only going to have one recommendation to the decadal survey, besides the findings that if we're so fortunate enough that the decadal survey comes back and is in full agreement that NASA should build a large space telescope, that we think that in-space assembly should be looked at, right? That we think that they should fund a point design study that is more detailed than what I just showed you, so that we can do a real apples to apples trade study between the current way that we do it versus in-space assembly. So we're not saying forget the past, by no means, but let's do a head-to-head trade study and see if we can continue to make this cost competitive and see if the risk benefits hold up. And if in-space assembly does, then we need to start closing some of the technology gaps and advance the engineering as quickly as possible. So I think in-space assembly has a life, and that life might actually occur sooner than a lot of people think. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. That was a very interesting talk. So now let's start the Q&A period. Now we have a bunch of questions here. I see 5 of them that have been submitted. So let's see here. There we go. So let's see.
Sorry,
Meredith.
Well, we can just go down in order they're submitted, okay. And then I will unmute you. So Lisa has a list of all the questions, and she will say who's going to ask a question, and then I will unmute you, and then you can feel free to go ahead and ask your question. And hopefully this works well.
Okay, so the first question, Jens Kaufman had a question.
Okay. Let's see. Jens, you should be unmuted.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for giving this talk. So I was wondering, to what extent is the assembly redundant against errors you might be making, like you have a mirror module getting stuck in the wrong place, or during assembly the robot arm does something weird and the sun shielding gets torn.
Yeah.
To what extent have you thought about that you can swap out parts, are redundant against simply doing things that were unexpected and difficult to resolve? Do you really need to do lesser testing than having when you just unfold things, so to say?
Yeah. So clearly we need to make a decision to what degree is your space telescope modularized so that it could be repaired, right? So the team decided not to make the telescope 100% repairable. So there's, for example, some structure that in the models predict should never ever be damaged behind the telescope. Perhaps that won't be readily accessible. But things, I think you pointed out some really good ones. So if one of the segments is damaged, or it's just not, its rigid body actuator is not putting it in the proper position, then yes, at least during this first round of discussions, we decided to make all of the rafts repairable. Well, actually not repairable, replaceable, right? It'll be hard to do very detailed repairs. So for something like that, I imagine in our costing profiles, we would have spares. So we would take a full raft out, put a new raft in. If the sun shade was to tear, which is a possibility, then we would have ways to replace a segment, or maybe the smart thing to do is to replace a whole roll. So that's really the benefits. These type of mishaps are almost probable, right? I once shared in front of an audience that if Hubble's first launch, where they saw the optical misalignment and the defocus, if that would have happened here, we would have just said, oops, we'll get that fixed in the next launch, because we had that capability. Hubble obviously had to suffer, and we were fortunate enough to have the shuttle program. So to answer your question, we're going to have as much modularization as possible so we can repair unlikely, but swap out most likely to be able to fulfill the overall architecture.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and now we have 3 questions from Lee.
Okay.
I unmuted myself. Can you hear me? I wasn't
Yes.
sure. Okay,
good.
thanks. Sorry, I was just I fired some things off to Meredith, but then I put them in the window so everyone could see them. So there were, Nick, that was a great talk. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
That was very, very interesting. I'm wanting to hear about what you guys have been up to for a while. So I had a question about Observatory INT, which I think you sort of tackled in one of the slides when you're talking about V&V. That, that is a big costly item on the ground for telescopes, and this is something that not clear that how that's going to be done in space, and how long it would take, or how much it would actually cost. I was wondering if you guys had sort of talked about that sort of final integration and testing, and what that would entail. That was the first question.
Yeah, in fact, let me take advantage of having my my co-lead. I see he's still on the phone. So Lisa or Meredith, if you can unmute Rudra Mukherjee.
Yep.
So Rudra has gone down this path with me every step of the way, and so I think let me allow him to answer that.
You should be
Hi,
unmuted.
everybody. Thank you for the question. So regarding in-space's V&V, I'd like to point out how we do the instrument assembly on the ISS these days, right? The instrument gets sent out, and it has a standard interface for assembly using the FRAM on the Japanese module. And then the robotic arm grapples it, brings it in, and assembles it. And then they do the checkouts on the connections for power and so forth. And we anticipate a very similar approach for the in-space assembly of the observatory and the V&V associated with that. We are anticipating that the assembly would be through a standardized interface that would have been tested out thoroughly on the ground through vibration and TVAC testing and so forth. And it's the same interface being repeated multiple times for each of the modules. And so the process of in-space AINT and VNV is, well, you use the prescribed process for the robotic assembly similar to what we do on the ISS now. And then you have an onboard metrology unit that would check for the accuracy or the precision of the assembly. And you would have predetermined steps for checking out whether you can get power and come through it and so forth. So borrowing from our experience on the ISS and taking some of the steps that we do on the ground into space, backed by a very robust campaign of testing in VNV of a standard interface on the ground. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that it's I think that does answer it. I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult. I would say that it's a slightly different sort of scenario than the one that you outlined, because you're assembling an entire observatory from scratch instead of adding pieces to an existing platform. That part is easy to test. I think it's the whole thing together that has, very stringent requirements that will be difficult. But I mean, it's a great challenge to be thinking about. Do you want me to go down the other questions, Lisa and Meredith? I wasn't sure.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. I fired off a couple. So
yeah, no.
The other one, Nick, was I couldn't help thinking about what if we wanted to do a cryogenically cooled telescope. That's another level of complexity, just by itself, but also for contamination and everything, that makes things really tricky. So how have you guys sort of tackled that, or is that sort of something for a future study?
Yeah, Lee, we if you remember back on my assumptions chart, we all agreed that the cryo adds a level of complexity, as you just said, and the contamination issues are critical, that we didn't want to draw attention away from the potential benefits of what in-space assembly offers and then suddenly turn our study into a referendum on building cryogenic telescopes. So we all agreed, let's just avoid that for the time being, and we would love to revisit this study, factoring in the requirements of cryo.
Yeah, I think that would be really great, because one of the, we talked about the fairings a lot about being restrictive, but one of the restrictive aspects of the cryogenic telescopes is actually the testing on the ground and having test facilities that are actually big enough to do it. So this would be something that would be a great topic for a future group. Anyway, okay, so thanks, Nick. And the last one was about just the time scale, I think. You had a great slide that sort of showed all the steps, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but I wasn't sure about if you guys had talked about the time scale for the whole process.
Yeah, that's right. I did. I did not mention it. Rudra, would you like to respond to that for me?
Sorry, can you be a little more specific about the timeline question? I'm not sure what you're talking about there.
Just the timeline question for the launches, for the assembly, for the testing, just to give us a sort of a rough order of magnitude for this for this reference plan that you have worked out compared to what assembling a similar sized telescope and going through the instrument INT, the observatory INT on the ground would be, just to give us a ballpark sort of time scale.
Sure, and as you can, as I can preface this is a fair amount of planning, and so for the 5-meter telescope going up in 2 launches, the separation between those launches is not anticipated to be significant. The overall assembly time, based on things that we do on the ISS, some of the things that are being planned for the NASA tipping point activities that will have in-space assembly demonstrations, and what was done on Orbital Express, for example, is expected to be about 6 weeks for the end-to-end assembly and the commissioning of the observatory. Nominal processes holding good. If there are off-nominal issues, well, they need to be handled on a as-needed basis. And then the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the 20-meter observatory assembly and INT and commissioning approach, that is expected to take several years, up to about 4 to 6 years time frame. And that time frame is not dominated by the robotic assembly or in-space V&V. It's the launch cadence, the programmatic cost impacts, and the development cycles. We anticipate that assembly of each of the modules is a matter of few days, and not a very long process. And again, if as we go forward, if there are off-nominal issues, those will obviously introduce errors.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's for the 5-meter release. That's a lot faster than I would have guessed, but that's pretty good. Okay, yeah, I think that was it for me. Thanks, Lisa and Meredith.
Okay, great.
Okay, so the next question comes from Dan.
You should be unmuted.
Okay, maybe I'll read it. Or how about we jump to my question? For the assembly of the telescope, about how many launches will be necessary for the parts, and where do you put these parts before they're being placed? I can't figure out what's up there where you can put stuff.
Okay, well, here I can just show you. Let me just go back and. Oh, there we go. So in terms of putting, so here's an example of, here's our spacecraft bus, and you can see we show ideally these portals. So each of the upper stage vehicles that we're calling the cargo delivery vehicle, there are just chocker block full of modules. They can be docked, at least from this configuration, looks like they can fit about 3 of them. Right, so we're not sitting there waiting for the next launch.
I see.
And obviously there's going to be a sequence, right? Here you see the solar arrays have been deployed, and the robot is already assembling the basis, the structural foundation of the telescope itself, and then it's going up in this direction, assembling the back plane of the telescope. And what's nice about this is that as soon as we're done with one level of the assembly, we have a series of checkouts that we can do. And one of the challenges in space is you're in zero gravity, and so on Earth we're always trying to back out the 1G that the assembly is occurring under, and we get to do our V&V in the right environment. So that actually will help if we see any problems, or if we see our modeling is incorrect. It gives us a chance to correct and prepare for the next delivery.
Great. Okay. Thank you. We have a question from Nassim.
Should we go back to Dan, who has his?
Oh yes, is
hand
Dan?
up?
Is Dan here? Oh yes, the hand is up. Let's do that.
I think.
Yeah, Dan, you should be unmuted. Weird. The hand is there.
Well, perhaps if it's not working, you can just go ahead and read it, Lisa, just to
Okay.
make sure that.
Okay, so Dan's question was, did you look in the beginning at unconnected swarming telescope elements rather than robotic arm assembled components? Higher risk, more unknowns, obviously.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We took some time early on to make sure that we were selecting a reference telescope that was as believable as possible. But we did look at things that were innovative. So we did look at, for example, partially full apertures. I guess we call them sparse apertures. Some people were very big on that, so you don't have to build a 20-meter fully apertured telescope, a fully populated telescope. You can just have a sliver. We looked at on-axis telescopes, which is the traditional. We did talk about swarms. In fact, there was someone on our team from Caltech who has experience with these, and it's quite innovative, and we would have loved to talk about it. But in the end, again, every step of the way, we chose architectures and architectures whose technology needs were not huge leaps, because we were very concerned that if, just imagine if I would have shown the swarm, people would have just been so transfixed on the swarm that we would have never gotten to the assembly. Now the swarms actually doesn't require all of that assembly, so that's one of the benefits there. But the TRL level of that is like 2, and a lot of the things here that I just showed you are, if not TRL 9, there's certainly TRL 4 and 5. So we're in the ballpark. So yes, we wanted something that is believable and something that could potentially impact the 2020 decade, right? They're deliberating right now, and we hope they pick a 5 to 10 meter class telescope for infrared or visible astronomy, and we want to be ready. The swarming, even though it's very compelling, is just probably a little too far out there in terms of TRL.
Nick, Dan mentions that there's a Cornell study looking at swarm herding or
Yep.
heading out to L2. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen them. I think it was funded by NIAC, and it's quite clever. It's innovative. It just is perhaps not ready for prime time just yet, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibilities.
Okay. And our last question was from Naseem. She said, in your study, do you have a roadmap? What are the first few things that you would like to do or to see happen first, or first few tests? And there's a little bit more. In the past decadal surveys, have studies like this, very forward-looking, and something that will be needed in a few decades being submitted? This is an investment that we make now so that the next decadal survey could use it to inform their decisions about next big missions.
Yeah, let me tackle the second question. Right. I mean, it is certainly within the realm of possibilities that the 2020 decadal survey will be very impressed by all the white papers that are that have been submitted and will continue to be submitted up until July 10 for stuff like this and programs. If I speak from my science base, exoplanets is desperately benefited from large telescopes because of lambda over D in particular, and infrared astronomy the same. So it's within the realm of possibilities that they will come back and say, yes, we believe the outstanding science that large telescopes will offer. And if they come back with a 10-meter class recommendation, boy, that would be super exciting. And yes, right now at 10 meters, we are likely to claim that we should pause. We, NASA, should pause and do a full-blown, intense, detailed trade study on whether or not in-space assembly is the correct implementation approach now rather than later. So that could affect us right now. Now, some people might argue that it's not quite ready, and maybe it should be for something in the future, especially if they are more modest. Maybe they come back with a 4-meter class or a no-meter class. Then yes, then we certainly, our roadmap would recommend continue to advance the technology gaps associated with this. I didn't have time to show you the technology and engineering gaps, but you'll definitely see them in our final white paper report due on July 10. So that's coming. So the bottom line is, if in-space assembly is not needed in the next decade, then we will continue to point out where NASA should be investing in engineering developments and technology gaps. And if it is needed, then we're going to have to accelerate that process sooner than later. And again, I have a list, I just didn't show it.
Okay, great. I think that is all the questions. We're also well beyond 2 o'clock. So let's end there. If you have any further questions, you can go ahead and, for our speaker or for the Leadership Council, you can just continue submitting them in the chat, and we'll try and, answer them by email. But let's thank our speaker again for a really wonderful talk. And thanks to all of you for joining us for another IR SIG webinar. We try and have these webinars every first Tuesday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern. So please join us for future webinars. And then lastly, if you yourself are interested in speaking at a webinar, or you would like to nominate someone as a speaker, please contact any of us on the IRSAG Leadership Council with your suggestion. We are especially invite suggestions for early career scientists of diverse backgrounds. And with that, thanks to all of you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good. I will stop the recording.
Okay. Oh, Nick's gone.
Yep. I think pretty much everybody head off. Okay.
Well, that went well.
Recording.